Our theme today is an American alternative. And I'm going to seize on this selection of the central theme to try and bring together the different aspects of the programmatic part of the argument, as this course has been both an interpretation of American experience and of major currents in American history, and at the same time an attempt to imagine alternatives, the next steps in the development of the American national project. So what I'm going to try to do today is systematically to work out, to make explicit the second element, bringing together ideas that have been presented separately all along the course of the semester. And the way we're going to do this is I'm going to speak, but John is going to interrupt me, I hope, frequently. And all of you should raise your hands as well when you want to interrogate me, because we're not going to divide rigidly the presentation and the subsequent questioning. We're going to try to mix them as we go along.
So we'd like it to be a discussion, a kind of
Both a presentation and a discussion. That's it. And I hope the presentation will be an incitement to the discussion all along the way. Now I begin with some preliminaries. Some of the preliminaries are about the way in which the programmatic alternative that we've been trying to imagine represents a response to what happened in American history, and can be contrasted to what turned out to be the major positions developed by the United States in the course of its historical making. And other preliminaries have to do with the nature of the programmatic argument itself, both in its method and in its substance. So this alternative that I'm going to outline today is different from the last major transformative project in the United States, Roosevelt's project in the New Deal. Because its emphasis is on economic empowerment, on socially inclusive growth, and on the democratization of the market order, rather than, as Roosevelt's New Deal was, on the restabilization of the economy and the provision of safeguards against economic insecurity. Before Roosevelt, there were two major reform traditions in the United States, traditions of progressive reform. One of them defended the little against the big, small business against big business. This is the tradition that goes from Jefferson to Brandeis. And the other, more closely identified with the progressivism of the early 20th century, accepted the role of big business in occupying the commanding heights of the economy, but attempted to submit it to strong regulation by the federal government, by the central government. But the episode in American history, or the part of American history, to which this project that I'm going to outline is most responsive is the one that we discussed at the very beginning of the course. Remember, there was the idea there that in the period from independence to the Civil War, the United States was built by a combination of two things. On top, Hamilton's project of national development, which literally built the country, opened it up, developed its physical infrastructure, and did so, for example, on the basis of the use of the public debt as a source of financing. And below, bottom up rather than top down, the selective democratization of what were then the two most important sectors of the American economy, agriculture and finance. The Americans developed family-scale agriculture with entrepreneurial attributes, rejecting the English path of agrarian concentration, and they dissolved the national bank and created the most decentralized system of credit at the disposal of the local producer that had ever existed in the world. And this is what I'm calling the selective democratization of the economy. So the thesis is that the development of the United States has to be understood as a result of the interaction of these two projects, the one at the top and the ones at the bottom. And that from the outset, this combination, this marriage of national development with selective democratization suffered from two frailties that became manifest as American history wore on. The weakness of democracy, as I called it, and the weakness of thought. The democratic politics that the Americans had organized in their Constitution was what I labeled a proto-democratic liberalism. It restrained popular influence and permitted the perpetuation of an economic oligarchy. And in thought, they failed to make explicit the general idea implicit in the selective democratization of agriculture and finance, namely that the market order has no single necessary and natural form, and that it can be radically reshaped. And these two limitations, the political limitation and the intellectual limitation, according to the argument presented earlier in the course, helped account for the cumulative weakening of this virtuous combination in the early history of the Republic of national development, of a mobilizational project of national development, combined with the selective democratization of particular parts of the economy. Now I want to say a word also by way of preliminary about the character of this argument as a programmatic argument, emphasizing both method and substance. So in method, you remember the idea that I evoked very early in the course about the dilemma of programmatic argument. I present an argument to you with proposals very distant from what now exists. You say that's interesting, but it's utopian. I present an argument close to what exists. You say it's feasible, but it's trivial. Almost anything that can be proposed in the current climate of opinion is likely to be dismissed as either utopian or trivial. And the claim is that this dilemma is a false dilemma, although it does threaten to paralyze the programmatic imagination and transformative practice, because a programmatic argument should not be approached as a series of blueprints, but rather as a succession of steps. And any trajectory worth considering in detail can be considered at points relatively close to what exists or relatively far away. What matters is the direction. The most important attributes of a programmatic argument on this view are that it marks a direction, and that in a particular historical circumstance, it selects the initial steps by which to begin to move in that direction. Now, this false dilemma was greatly complicated in the history of modern ideas by an intellectual event. And the intellectual event was the failure of the major social theories that attempted to explain structural change, Marxism chief among them. That is, Marxism presents a view of how structural change happens. There's a closed list of indivisible regimes in the world. Marx calls them modes of production. Each of them is an indivisible system from which there results a binary view of politics. Politics is either the reformist management of one of these indivisible systems, or the revolutionary substitution of one by another. And there are laws of historical change governing the foreordained succession of these indivisible systems in history. All of that has become literally incredible. Those are what one might call the illusions of false necessity. And because of that failure, and the failure of theories like that, we have no usable and credible way of thinking and arguing about structural change. So then we fall back on a fake criterion of political realism, which is that a proposal is realistic to the extent that it is close to what already exists. Now, of course, it's not an idea, a view of how to think about structural change or structural alternatives. It is a confession of intellectual bankruptcy. And that also helps explain this difficulty that we have about programmatic argument. But the idea is to persist. And if we don't have the right social theory, then we have to create one, as it were, on the fly. Little by little, we have to simulate one, we have to evoke one. Otherwise, we can't think and imagine programmatically. And programmatic thought is very important to the understanding of experience, because the only way in which we can understand anything in the world, either natural or social, is to have a view of what it can become. All real insight into the actual is necessarily transformative insight. So it's not just that our view of American history informs our vision of the alternatives, it's also that our imagination of the alternatives influences our view of the experience, of the national experience. Now, in substance, what I want to say about the character of the programmatic argument that I'm going to outline is that its emphasis is on the change of the institutional arrangements that shape and define a market order, a democracy, and an independent civil society outside the market and outside the state. And it therefore points in the direction of a new form of ideological conflict in the world. Not just the conflict to which we are accustomed, which is about the relative importance of the market and of the state. More market, less state, more state, less market. Synthesis of market and state, which would be social democracy or social liberalism. But the alternative forms, the alternative institutional forms of economic, political, and social pluralism, that is the market, democracy, and independent civil society. So the emphasis is on structure, and in this sense, it's like the ideas of the liberals and socialists of the 19th century. But unlike them, it recognizes that we have reason not to entrust our futures to a dogmatic institutional blueprint. So one of the most important attributes of these institutional proposals must be that they help organize and facilitate their own revision in the light of experience. In other words, that they have the attribute of being experimentalist and promoting an ongoing democratic experimentalism. That's what I wanted to say first by way of describing the character of this programmatic argument. Now, one more thing that regards the division between conservatives and progressives, and right and left. The dominant position of the progressives today in much of the world is institutionally conservative social democracy. That is, it has no productivist project, it has no progressive approach to the supply side of the economy. It abandons the question of the supply side and of the organization of the economy to the right, and then it seems to it wants to humanize, it seeks to humanize the market order that results from this institutional conservatism. And we see this not just in practical politics, but also in philosophy, in political philosophy and theory. For example, in the theories of distributive justice, like the Rawlsian theory. They appear on their face to be radically egalitarian. They have a commitment to equality as the supreme commanding principle, but they combine this profession of egalitarian faith with an institutional conservatism or skepticism, agnosticism. They have no properly structural proposals. And when you add these two elements, the profession of egalitarian faith and the structural agnosticism or skepticism, the lack of institutional content, what results then is a kind of pseudo-philosophical prop to the homely practices of compensatory redistribution under social democracy. That is, what they attempt to justify is corrective retrospective redistribution by tax and transfer, by progressive taxation on the revenue-raising side, and then redistributive social spending or social entitlements on the spending side of the budget. In other words, what they attempt to justify is the humanization of the established market order rather than its reshaping. And they suffer then from a crucial defect, because the force that commands the agenda in politics and in thought is always the one that most credibly embodies the cause of creation, of innovation, of energy, and not just as the institutionally conservative social democracy has done, the humanization of what is supposedly inevitable. So social democracy has been hollowed out of many of its historical features, which involve deals protecting tenured insiders, relatively stable workers, for example, in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy, to the detriment of outsiders, the workers who were unstably employed in the so-called secondary part of the labor market. And it has retreated to its last line of defense, which is the maintenance of a high level of social entitlements in Europe, for example, paradoxically financed by the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption. And that eviscerated form of social democracy is what we sometimes call social liberalism. So then there arises a vacuum, because politics is unable to solve or even to address the major structural problems of society. And in that vacuum, authoritarian populism comes in, like right-wing populism, plutocratic populism, but it itself has no strong structural project other than to impose restraints on migration and to strengthen executive authority, so the vacuum is perpetuated. So it's against that background that an alternative like the one that I am about to outline is presented. And then I'm ready to go into the substance of the outline. Let me ask first whether you would like to discuss any part of that, John, or you, the class?
Yeah, so in discussing the market order, could you say a little bit more about the dramatic divide between the North and the South until really the mid-20th century?
Well, there were two there were two different political economies.
Yes.
Because in the North, we had predominantly a kind of petty bourgeois capitalism, right?
Yes,
petty
artisanal.
And artisanal, and that, until the war. I'm talking about until the war. An economy of artisans, of small-scale proprietors, of craftsmen.
Yeah.
But there was a nascent plutocracy congregating at the top around this project of national development, this Hamiltonian project, and its instrument was the National Bank.
Yes.
And the opponents were willing to deprive themselves of the immense help that the National Bank might have offered to them in order to deny the instruments to the plutocracy. And they dissolved the bank. So in the South, we had something completely different. We had a slave economy, and a slave economy which accepted all the prescriptions of the economic orthodoxy of that day, such as free trade.
Yes. They didn't
So
insist
the
on-
North was against high protectionist barriers, which only increased later on, and were maintained until well into the 20th century, at least until the 1920s. And the South had accepted its niche in the world division of labor, the production and export of commodities on the basis of slave labor. And that conflict between those two paradigms was then resolved in the Civil War.
Slave labor, and then afterwards sharecropping.
Yes, or its functional equivalence.
Yes, it's
Because what came after the Civil War was to some extent the functional equivalent of what was there before.
that's right.
Yes.
You outlined the dominant position of progressives today, but I don't think, and forgive me if I just didn't catch it, you outlined,
Could you speak a little louder, please?
sure, you outlined the dominant position of the progressives today, but I don't think quite got to the conservative position. Is that what you were talking about earlier, in earlier classes about the supply, or would you say that their dominant position today is...
So let me reinterpret the distinction between right and left. First, at the level of ideology, because at the level of real social interest and real social forces, it's a different story. But at the level of ideology, the conventional shape of the ideological debate is what you could call shallow freedom against shallow equality. So on that view, who are the leftists? The leftists are the ones who prioritize equality against the background of the established institutional arrangements. And the right are the ones who prioritize freedom against the same background. And then what's the alternative view of the division? And so they both accept the institutional arrangements, and they disagree about the relative importance of freedom and equality. That would be a simple reading of the conventional shape of the ideological dispute. Now, what am I proposing? And implicit in the programmatic argument that I'm about to outline, what I'm proposing is that we begin to think of the distinction between conservative and progressive, right and left, in a completely different way. And that on this way, what is the difference of attitude to structure that characterizes the progressives? The progressives would be the ones who believe that we can affirm our interests and our identities only by transgressing the limitations of the present institutions. In other words, every significant change must be an institutional or a structural change. It must associate institutional change with change of the ideological representations with which the institutional arrangements are connected. We shouldn't think of structural change in the old Marxist way of systemic change, one indivisible system replacing another. Systemic change, structural change is characteristically fragmentary or piecemeal, but it can nevertheless become cumulative, and if it persists in a certain direction, it even deserves to be called revolutionary. So those would be the progressives. The progressives are the ones who believe in the primacy of structural change, even though they resist succumbing to a structural dogmatism. And the conservatives would be then the ones who accept that the established political and economic arrangements define the horizon within which we must pursue our interests and identities. Now, of course, under that criterion, almost all the contemporary progressives are conservatives because the dominant progressive position is institutionally conservative social democracy, which tries only to humanize a market order which it despairs of remaking and reinventing. And on the view which I've just stated, it is then conservative. And there's a second difference then, on this altered view, between the right and the left, between the conservatives and the progressives. The difference regards the goal. That is, who are the conservatives? The conservatives are the ones who believe that it's natural for human life to be small. There are inventors, innovators, heroes, thinkers who are exceptions. But the ordinary life of the ordinary man and woman is small, unless there's some dramatic event like war, which requires extraordinary devotions and sacrifice. The progressives would be the ones who would believe that we can all ascend to a higher form of life, with greater capabilities, broader scope, larger intensity, but we must ascend together or not at all. We become bigger, we become greater, but we become greater together or not at all. And that's, as it were, the difference of direction or the difference of goal between progressives and conservatives. Now, it's very hard to translate this philosophical idea of the contrast between right and left into the practical politics of any one country. Because what we see is that, for example, in the United States, that both of the major political parties have a working class base, but a different working class base. So one working class base is relatively uncredentialed, and it then resents the characteristic projects of the pseudo-progressive elite, such as what I call the threshold approach to the relation between race and class, and the adoption of a modernist or secular moral agenda, which it has attempted in recent American history to impose by law, by the activism of the federal courts. And the Progressive Party has its base in the part of the working class that is benefited by the discourse of diversity and inclusion and may be relatively more credentialed, and then adopts all of these forms which perpetuate social democracy but abandon the ambition to change the structures. So it's a different view of the division between right and left. But in that view, in that balance between right and left, it's as if the left part of the scale were empty. Because who are these leftists who I've described? And of course, that's why we're here developing this argument. Yes. Yes.
Oh, sorry. When you discuss like this conservative idea of an ordinary life of humans, is it an ordinary life in all aspects or an ordinary life in relation to their work? Like how do we define?
Well, I think it depends who is the representative here of the right or the left, because for the philosophers like Nietzsche, it's in every aspect of life, right? Or although Emerson is supposed to be the philosopher of democracy, according to John Dewey,
Yes.
his
was inspired by
characterization of exemplary individuals or exemplary lives has the same thing. That is, the greatness is manifest in this exceptional breaking of the limits. The Democrat has to believe, according to this contrary view that I've stated, that we can all ascend. So the Protestant Reformation asserted the priesthood of all believers.
There's almost a religious aspect who the conservatives are and who the progressives are. Conservatives, human life is small, aesthetic. And so there's a separation between this world and the next, the heaven, in one sense.
Well, not just that. It's that so there's a division between the enactment of transcendence and the enactment of immanence.
Yes.
For a religion like Christianity,
Yes.
the divine must become incarnate in the world.
Yes.
Huh?
But for progressives, all ascend to higher forms of life suggests a kind of heaven on earth.
No, that would be a heresy, right? That would be Pelagianism. That
but
would
it's
be
also very much part of the apocalyptic tradition in the U.S., in which the Jesus comes back and there is an apocalypse that leads to a millennium. Both it could be premillennialist or postmillennialist. So premillennium it begins with the apocalypse, and then there's a 1,000-year reign.
But the Christian has to believe that the historical events are enveloped in a larger narrative, and that the plan of redemption, although it advances in history, is not exhausted by what happens in historical time. It goes beyond history.
Yes.
So at some point, by some set of events, apocalyptic or eschatological, there's a connection between the historical and the transhistorical,
Yes.
and the human reaches up to the divine. Huh?
Yes.
But this theme that you've asked me about is related to the message of the American prophets, and that's yet another way in which this project can be related to what happened in American history. Because the prophets had the American prophets, Whitman, Lincoln, Emerson, they had this message that the individual human being participates in the inner life of God.
Yes.
And I argued that from the outset, the prophetic message in the United States bore two taints. It bore the taint of an inadequate view of the relation between individual self-construction and solidarity, failing adequately to recognize that solidarity is internal to self-construction rather than something that comes later. And it bore the taint of institutional idolatry, of believing that the Americans discovered at the time of the foundation of the Republic the definitive form of a free society, both in economics, the market order, the reified market order that has one single natural and necessary form, and in politics, their proto-democratic liberalism would be the essential formula of democracy. The founders then were, in a sense, not just a kind of collective like Kyrgyz, giving to the Americans their definitive political form, but they were the instruments of this revelation,
Yes.
both religious and political,
Yes.
which the Americans received at the beginning. And so what do I want? I want to sympathize with the American prophets in their central message that the individual can increase, the ordinary man and woman can increase his or her quota in the divine attribute of transcendence. The ordinary person can become more human by becoming more godlike, not in the sense of omniscience and omnipotence, but in the sense of transcendence. But must repudiate those two spiritual failures, those two forms of blindness that I described, the disturbed imagination of the relation between solidarity and self-construction, and the institutional idolatry. A Christian must think that all the institutional dogmas in the world are dust in the eyes of God. All are imperfect, some less imperfect than others, but we are in a progression. And history must be regarded as open and not be subordinate to some definitive formula or finding in which we are forever imprisoned. So shall I go ahead now to the content?
Any other questions before the content? I mean, there were I mean, the Civil War was, there's a lot of great scholarship literature on the Civil War and in the way in which both Northerners and Southerners defined it literally in apocalyptic terms. The Civil War brings about this apocalypse that will open the way to this millennium. Frederick Douglass, for just as an example, he literally says the Civil War is nothing other than Michael and his angels battling against Satan, which comes right directly from Revelation as well as some other words.
Yes. Yes, you know, another way which has been mentioned in the course to understand the spirit of this alternative by reference to institutionally conservative social democracy is this. Institutionally social democracy is fundamentally concerned with securing the individual in a haven of safeguards against public and private oppression, and of capability ensuring endowments, such as education or economic security. But this alternative that we've been discussing in a piecemeal fashion is not just about the haven, it's about the storm around the haven. That the individual should be secure in this haven so that society in its economic and political organization can be opened up to the storm of innovation and experiment, and everything turns then on this dialectical relation between the haven and the storm. So then the content of the storm, or of the institutional arrangements that perpetuate this storm. First, in political economy, in the organization, in the democratization of the market order. And today there are three great themes. In order of importance, first, the most important, is the relation of the advanced parts of production to the backward parts. Second, the relation of labor to capital. And third, the relation of finance to the real economy or to the productive agenda of society. So with respect to the first theme, the relation of the vanguard to the rest, in every historical circumstance, there is a most advanced part of production. The most advanced part, the vanguard, is not necessarily at the moment of its emergence the most efficient part of production, the one that produces the most outputs with the fewest inputs. It is the one with the greatest fecundity to perform an exemplary role in the economy. It inspires the transformation of all the other parts. And now the new vanguard is what we call the knowledge economy, or the innovation economy, or the experimentalist economy. We shouldn't mistake it just for the platform oligopolies of Silicon Valley. It is present in every part of the economy, in intellectually dense services, and even in precision or scientific agriculture, as well as in advanced knowledge-based manufacture. But in every part of the economy, it exists only as a socially exclusive fringe. It excludes the great majority of businesses and of workers. And this insular character of the new vanguard has momentous consequences for both economic slowdown, the slowing down of economic growth and of the growth of productivity, and economic inequality. So if we deny the most advanced practice to the majority of people in the labor force, it's natural that there would be slowdown, because the rest are in a sense consigned to some form of make work. And it's only in this favored elite that the vanguard exists. And economic inequality, because the inequality is anchored in this deeper and deeper abyss between the vanguard and the rest. So for this abyss to be overcome by progressive taxation and by redistributive social spending, the retrospective and redistributive spending would have to be vast. So vast that long before it reached the dimension necessary to address the problem, it would begin to derange the established economic institutions and incentives, the incentives to save, invest, and employ, and exact an unacceptable cost in lost output. So that's the reason why compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer cannot have more than a marginal effect on inequality. Its great achievement, as the example of the European social democracies shows, is to sustain a high level of investment in people and in their capabilities. So what would be the task? The task would be to deepen and disseminate this vanguard, to make it a broad-based in the economy and open to the widest parts of society. And we can imagine steps by which this would take place. So in the initial steps, the object would be to develop a 21st century counterpart to 19th century agricultural extension, to bring advanced practice and the finance that it's associated with and advanced knowledge, as the agricultural extension did, to two kinds of agents. First, to the small and medium-sized businesses that are pushed back to the qualitative rear guard of production, and second, to the individualized economic agents who have no stable contact with business organizations. The small and medium-sized businesses would have to be brought closer to the vanguard, and the individual
remaining small and individualized.
Unless they, yes, because the majority do not become big.
Right.
They remain that.
Right.
But the idea would be that we bring this rear guard closer to the vanguard,
Right.
and we have to then present them with these advanced technologies and practices in a form that they're capable of assimilating.
Right. But
And that then becomes the task of the state.
Right. But there's a history of the larger organization will want to acquire and
If
incorporate.
a small number of startups that are extremely promising, but I'm not talking about those for the most part. I'm talking about the multitude of ordinary small businesses, which are the vast majority of them technologically and methodologically primitive.
Right.
They have to be brought closer to the vanguard. And that's the operation that I'm comparing to the selective democratization of the economy in the early 19th century, and would proceed by similar instruments. So there have to be intermediate support centers between the government, national or local government, and the small-scale producer.
Right.
They have to disseminate technology and advanced practices. We have to define empirically and experimentally what works and what doesn't work, discover what works, and then disseminate it broadly in the economy. For example, the multi-sectoral technologies that are useful. So let's say that's the first stage. The second stage then in the evolution of this knowledge economy for the many is the development of a different model of government-business relations. Because there are now two models in the world. There's the American model of arm's length regulation of business by government, and there's the Northeast Asian model of formulation of unitary trade and industrial policy imposed top-down by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. So we would have to invoke a third model, a form of decentralized partnership between government and the backward producer that is decentralized, pluralistic, participatory, and experimental. In other words, not one trade and industrial policy imposed on the producers, but a whole range of different alternatives tried out, experimented with, and then compared experimentally and competitively.
And what would encourage the producers to accept that? Because a
The
lot of them
desire
would say,
the desire to prosper, because, for example, among those small-scale businesses, many are family businesses, traditionally dependent on family saving and self-exploitation, and primitive, and with very, very little prospect of flourishing. So it's this idea that they have a better chance of ascending. And later, at the end, I want to come back to this question of who the agents are. And this phenomenon that we have in the world now, that the majority of humanity is relatively or absolutely poor, but already has a petty bourgeois horizon of aspiration. It's not, they're subjectively part of the small business class, even when objectively they're not.
So they define themselves as petty bourgeois when objectively they're not.
When they're not, that's right.
Yes.
So then a third stage in the evolution of this project is just a thought experiment. It's speculative, it's very remote from what we can have today, but it's the idea that I labeled in another class, capitalism without capitalism. Without capitalists. That is, we imagine the productive assets of society vested in independent trusts, and these trusts then conduct a rotating capital auction. So no one owns them. They're not owned by the state in the sense of the government. They're not subject to discretionary allocation by government. And they're not owned in the form of the unified traditional property right, which is owned by a single owner and can be transmitted through the hereditary transmission of property.
And I'm assuming it's not also framed as a corporation.
Well, the corporate form, which, by the way, was developed in Anglo-American law in the 19th century
Yes.
by John Stuart Mill to serve as a vehicle for the organization of workers. The corporate form can be again reinvented in all sorts of ways. So there's no absolute obstacle to the use of the legal vehicle of the corporation to serve radically different economic functions.
Right.
We shouldn't incur in the mistake of supposing that a legal vehicle like the corporation is necessarily only performs the functions that corporations now perform. It can have a public mission as it was intended originally
And
to
it
have.
did happen from the Revolution, the
Yes.
Charles River Bridge, from up until the end of the Civil War. It really had a public mission.
That's right.
Very, very few corporations, and all of them had public missions.
That's right. Now, I mentioned when I introduced this idea in an earlier class that this notion, there's a paradox about this notion, which is in orthodox finance theory, when I'm describing the radical experiment of the rotating capital funds as doing, which is to auction off capital to whoever can provide the trust for the highest rate of return over a certain time period, is supposedly what already happens in an efficient capital market. That is, an efficient capital market is already supposed to be this capital auction. And so one way of testing this is to ask, is to say, we don't want to trust this idealized notion of the capital auction. Let's organize an actual capital auction, and let's test in practice who is able to provide the highest rate of return. So that's the first axis in this progressive political economy. The second axis has to do with labor and capital. And there it's necessary to distinguish between the organized and the disorganized part of the labor market. Now the disorganized part is preponderant in all the major economies of the world, including the American economy.
Right.
So there are people who propose then to restore unionization.
Right.
And if one were to restore unionization, there might be a better regime than collective bargaining.
Right.
A regime that combined the corporatist principle of universal unionization of everyone,
Right.
according to his place in the production system,
Right.
with the contractualist principle of the complete independence of the unions from the state. But it may be too late for any such alternative. that it seems to be a lost cause, at least for the moment. And so we turn to the other part of the labor market, the disorganized part, where an increasing part of the labor force is in temporary, precarious, insecure employment. And there's an emergency problem, which is the need to organize a new regime of labor law that distinguishes legitimate and indispensable economic flexibility from undesirable economic insecurity and the cheapening of labor. So we would attempt to organize and represent this unstable labor to the extent we could using the new communication and information technologies. But to the extent that we couldn't, there would be direct legal intervention in the employment relation. For example, fixing the wage by comparison to the wage of the equivalent labor performed under terms of stable employment. That's what I call the principle of price neutrality. But that's, as it were, the emergency problem. And if we are to aspire to a dynamic of socially inclusive innovation, we must find a way to address the problem of precarious labor. Because there cannot be a dynamic of sustained and socially inclusive innovation in an economy in which the returns to labor become cheapened and labor itself is insecure. The extreme case is slavery. Slavery is incompatible with innovation. That's the fundamental problem of a slave economy. Not totally incompatible, but largely incompatible, because labor is both radically insecure and has no price other than the price of its physical reproduction. So let's say that's the first stage, this emergency problem of facing the reality of precarious labor. The second stage is then to engage the evolution of technology. Technology has no imminent logic of evolution. Technology will always, to some extent, replace labor, but what is open is the extent to which, as it replaces labor, it also enhances labor. And what we would want is to redirect the logic of evolution of technology so that it not just replace labor, but also enhance labor, as in the way in which artificial intelligence and robotics could be used to combine with labor and not just to replace labor. And that then, in that role, the state can perform a major function, both by its own initiatives, its own missions, for example, in the defense establishment, and the defense in the military-industrial complex, the source of many of the most radical technological innovations, and by the tax incentives and disincentives, the shaping of the evolution of technology. So we incentivize the forms that enhance labor and disincentivize the forms that simply replace labor. And the third stage then converges with the ultimate stage in the path from a knowledge economy for the few to a knowledge economy for the many. Radical innovation in the property regime. On the terms of decentralized access to productive resources and opportunities. The ultimate solution for labor is that everyone, in principle, have access to what Karl Marx called the means of production. Not by the state acquiring the control of the economy in the name of the workers, but by the productive assets of society being vested in vehicles that are open on the widest possible terms to the largest part of society. And that's the same idea of the capitalism without capitalists. And then the third axis, or the third basis of progressive political economy has to do with the relation between finance and the real economy. So finance should be enlisted in the service of the productive agenda of society, rather than being allowed simply to serve itself and to use the transactions of the real economy as its pretext. And to that end, we need in the short term to discourage or prohibit those forms of financial engineering that have no colorable relation to the expansion of output and the rise of productivity, and encourage those that do. The best way to make finance less dangerous is to make it more useful, and to embed finance in the real economy rather than allowing it to disembed ourselves. And we have this problem, which begins in the first enigma that I mentioned. The production system in all the contemporary economies, including the American economy, is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. And the activity of the capital markets, which would in principle be most important, which would be the production of new assets in new ways, as through venture capital, in fact is a minuscule part of the activity of the financial markets. No? So what we want to do then is to change this relation so that we have financial deepening rather than financial hypertrophy. And so that finance is made to serve the productive agenda, the agenda of production. And
so would the market itself be revised?
Both by arrangements and by incentives. So, for example, in addition to discouraging the forms of financial engineering that don't contribute to production and productivity, such as, for example, options contracts in the equity markets, as opposed to options contracts in the commodity markets.
Right.
Because in the commodity markets, they serve a purpose of liquidity.
That's right.
In the equity markets, they were originally conceived as antidotes to gambling,
Yes.
and they have been largely converted into devices of gambling.
Right.
So the problem, again, is not in the speculative element of finance, because speculation is useful to organize information and allocate risk.
Right.
The problem lies in the dissociation of the speculative element of finance from the real economy, from the transactions of the economy. And then we would multiply ways in which the large amount of saving in society, the surplus over current consumption that is held in the public and private pension systems of the world, can be channeled to a larger degree into diversified portfolios of investment in production, including in the production of new assets in new ways, the undone work of venture capital. So all of that I see as the initial stage, and then far into the future, the same ultimate outcome of the other currents, which is the multiplication of these forms of access to the productive resources of society, aside from traditional ownership and the absolute property right. So again, the idea is not that the disaggregation of the property right would be the only form of the market, this capitalism without capitalists, but that would be one of the forms or the major form. Because Instead of having the market economy nailed to the cross of a single dogmatic version of itself, we have alternative regimes of contract and property coexisting experimentally in the same market order. And one of those regimes would continue to be the traditional unified property right. Because as I remarked in an earlier class, the advantage of the unified property right is that it allows someone, the owner, to do something that no one else believes in.
Right.
And to assume a risk, his own risk that he pays for himself, and insists then on opening a frontier without having to negotiate a series of vetoes or agreements. So there'll be a role for that. What we would not want is for that to be the only form of decentralized economic organization. And this is a very important part about the market order, because as I said at the beginning, even at the highest level of abstraction, the idea of the market has two dimensions. One dimension is the absolute level of economic decentralization, the number of economic agents able to bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. And the other dimension is the absoluteness of the control that each of those agents has over those resources. Absolute in scope and absolute in time, because it goes beyond one's own life through the hereditary transmission of property. So the conventional idea is that these two dimensions go together, but they don't go together. On the contrary, they contradict each other. One of the ways in which we might increase absolute decentralization is by qualifying the absoluteness of the control in scope or in time. That's the disaggregation or fragmentation of the property right. So we have different component powers of the property right, and we vest them in different tiers of claimants on the productive resources, investors, workers, local governments, local communities, and ultimately capital takers, who are these people who bid away part of the productive resources of society from the investment trusts who hold those resources.
So how would that affect, say, the S&P 500, the ability to buy shares of the stock?
Well, they would be fragmentary, right?
Right.
So you would have some claim on something
Right.
to be defined. It could be the income stream,
Right.
but the only thing it couldn't be would be the ultimate right of alienation. That is the right to buy or sell the total package.
Right.
You would have some fragmentary part of the right, and that fragmentary part of the right could be the object of a market. Now, that actually is the device of contemporary financial markets.
Yes.
They are very largely markets in so-called derivatives,
Yes.
like puts and
Puts and
calls. And what
Which
are
has a very
derivatives?
limited time
The
frame.
term derivatives is a legal term.
Yeah.
They are derivatives in the sense that they are derivatives of the unified property
Yes,
right.
that's right.
They're a piece of the whole.
Right.
And that already is the basis of financial markets. So what we're describing here is the conversion of that analytic and juridical tool into this transformative effect.
Right.
So there you have a view of three major pillars of a progressive project in political economy. It's unnecessary to say, should be obvious to everyone here, that none of this is part of their idea. The idea of many of the American progressives is that the United States should become the Sweden of 1970, and there should be these social entitlements. Not that the market order should be reconstructed, and the productivist project should be embraced, but expanded in this democratic sense. So here you have it in spades. No? And an advantage of this method is that it makes very clear what the stakes are.
Right.
So you might say, well, let's begin modest, and I have begun modestly in each of them. But by carrying it forward, I want to show what the ultimate direction is. So in the exposition of a programmatic argument, we often have to appeal to this middle distance not very close nor very far away from what exists, in order to explain. But in practical politics, in the language of transformative practice and of political prophecy, the middle distance is inconvenient because it's too close to what exists to arouse enthusiasm, but too far away to seem feasible. And so the method of the political prophet is to combine the very practical with the very remote, and is thus simultaneously practical and prophetic. And that's what we need. But here, in this setting, where the premium is on conceptual clarification, I can allow myself this luxury. Now then, so that's all one domain, and it's naturally the heart of a progressive political economy. The second domain is the deepening of democracy. That is, the counterpart to the democratization of the market order is the deepening of democracy. All the democracies that exist in the world are to one or another extent weak democracies, flawed democracies. All of them impede reiterated structural change. All of them perpetuate the rule of the living by the dead. All of them continue to make change depend on crisis. So a high-energy democracy is a democracy that weakens the dependence of change on crisis and refuses to impose trauma as the price of transformation. And it achieves this result by three main sets of innovations. Innovations that raise the temperature of politics, the level of organized popular engagement in political life. Those have to do with the relation of politics to media, the relation of politics to money, the electoral regimes, and so forth. So we want a politics that is both hot and institutional, rather than deluding ourselves into thinking that politics must be either cold and institutional or hot and anti-institutional. Second, we want to hasten the pace of politics, resolving impasse quickly. And so in terms of the American constitutional architecture, that would mean doubling down on the liberal principle of the fragmentation of power, many sources of power in the state, but repudiating the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics, the Madisonian principle. And the way we would do that is every time there was an impasse between the political branches of government, we would design the constitutional mechanisms that would allow for the rapid breaking of the impasse. For example, by allowing either of the political branches to call early elections, which would, however, always be for both branches, so that the branch that exercised the constitutional prerogative would have to pay the political price of running the electoral risk. And in that way, we would convert the logic of the presidential regime into a machine for the acceleration of democratic politics. And the third major set of innovations would be innovations that combine a facility for decisive action by the central government with the opportunity for radical devolution. That is, as society goes down a certain path, parts of itself should be able to deviate from the dominant solutions, provided that this deviation is not used to entrench the privileges of a class or of a race, or to persecute another one, in order to generate counter-models of the national future. And then I added a fourth possible set of innovations when we discussed the creation in the state of a power specifically equipped and legitimated to come to the rescue of a group that finds itself caught in a circumstance of subjugation or exclusion from which it is unable to escape by the forms of collective political and economic action that are available to it. We had some discussion of which parts of this program are more and less accessible in the United States. As I said then, the American progressives seem to prefer emphasizing the first set of innovations, the ones that have to do with the temperature politics, but I think it would be wiser for them to emphasize the third set, which is the re-energizing of American federalism in its experimentalist mission, because that has very wide appeal in the country and wide appeal even across the divisions between right and left. So that's then this idea that we create little by little a high energy democracy, and a high energy democracy is the brother, the sister of the democratized market economy. Now, the third domain of innovation is independent civil society outside the state and outside the market, on the idea that a disorganized society cannot generate alternatives or act on them. So the premise is that the level of social capital organization is not a constant but a variable, and we can create it. Now, the most powerful way to create it is by the reformation of economics and of politics. So the knowledge economy, and especially the inclusive knowledge economy, depends on a heightening of the level of reciprocal trust and of discretionary initiative, allowed and required of all participants in the process of production. So it needs the accumulation of social capital. And that's expressed legally in the proliferation of relational contracts, ongoing relational contracts, incomplete bargains, for many exchanges of performance in the future, as opposed to the traditional contract, which is a bilateral executory promise, fully bargained out for an instantaneous single performance. And politics, because the high energy democracy is a democracy that favors the multiplication of forms of collective action, which is the ultimate basis of social cohesion. But we can also, in civil society itself, work to increase the density of association and multiply forms of collective action. For example, by the cooperative character of education, by innovations in the provision of public services. So we could say, now the only form of provision of public services in the world is what I call administrative Fordism. It's the provision of low quality services by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. We can imagine an alternative. The state provides the universal floor of public services. The state operates at the ceiling in the development of the costliest and most complex public services, but in the broad middle zone between the floor and the ceiling, the state partners with independent civil society, acting not for profit through cooperatives of health workers, educational workers, and so forth, for the competitive and experimental provision of public services. That's both the best way to enhance their quality and the best trigger for the self-organization of civil society outside the state. And finally, social service, that is the generalization of the principle that every able-bodied adult in society should have a double function in the system of production and skilling, and in taking care of other people beyond the boundaries of one's own family. So everyone exempt from military service should be subject to mandatory social service for part of his life. And in that mandatory social service, he can receive also basic training to be to form part of a reserve force that can be mobilized in case of national emergency. Because there's the fantasy that in war, people can be replaced by technology, but we know that that's not true. That's right. And that in real war, the ultimate test is the presence of people, of men and women in space, in the territory, that to complement the work done remotely by by technology. And so in such a society, social cohesion arises not from inherited similarity, consanguinity, or affinity, but from joint purposeful action, the multiplication of forms of ways in which people do things together, oriented to the future rather than remembered from the past. And the fourth domain is education and the creation of the individual. The individual who, like the seraph Abdiel, should be unseduced, unshaken, unterrified by the storm that rages around him. And in a country that is large and very unequal and federal in structure like the United States, the background condition is to reconcile the local management of the schools by the states and municipalities with national standards of investment and quality. And for that, we need a national system of assessment to see what works, student by student and school by school. We need a redistributive mechanism to transfer resources and staff from richer places to poorer places. And we need a corrective mechanism in the federal system to associate the three levels of the federation in joint bodies that can take over local failing school systems, attribute their reformation to independent activists, fix them and return them fixed. So this is not a project that could prosper under the command of educational despots and their technocratic assistants. It would have to be a national movement of thousands of teachers and hundreds of schools engaged in this construction.
Yeah.
But when it is viewed in that way, it is a project of national liberation. So there you have the outline of this program. And there's just one more thing that I want to add to it, which is then the final part about the constituency. And who are the people who would do this? So, and I want to approach this from outside the United States, thinking now for a moment about the world. So in the world as a whole, the thesis is, when does change happen? Change happens when there are these growth miracles, these miracles of national empowerment and prosperity. And there are two elements. So there's an element in the elite. In the elite, there has to be a part of the elite that rebels against another part and appeals to the country as a whole. And this contrary part of the elite has to combine productivism with nationalism. Now that was the Hamiltonian elite.
Right.
At the start of the United States, it was both productivist and nationalist. And then it did appeal to the larger society, and it had a partner in all of these movements that then created the democratization of credit and the democratization of agriculture. But the most important part is then the mass. And here came the thesis about the circumstance in the world. So in the world now, in all the major countries of the world, most people are poor, if not absolutely poor, then relatively poor. But their horizon of aspiration is petty bourgeois, rather than proletarian. They aspire to a modest prosperity and independence. And the default way of achieving this aspiration is then to have traditional family business, isolated, archaic, retrograde family business. The spiritual counterparts to this default economic form are consumerism, individualism, materialism, and so forth. The mistake made by the progressives in the 20th century in Europe was then to have demonized the small business class, which then became the mainstay of the fascist and Nazi and right-wing movements. And now in the world, if we define the petty bourgeoisie subjectively rather than objectively, it's the majority of humanity. So that has to be the constituency. Now, I'm not sure what the American counterpart to that is, but it seems clear that in the American elites, for a project like the one that I've outlined to advance, there has to be in the elites this secession or rebellion of a productivist and nationalist part of the elite, which then seeks to reignite the project of production. The United States, after all, is the country in the world in which the knowledge economy exists most prominently. But even in the United States, it exists only in the form of these socially exclusive fringes. So the project of the creation of a knowledge economy for the many is an exemplary productivist project in the United States and would be the natural height of ambition of this counter-elite that would have to form in the country. But then there's the mass, that the mass would have to be converted to this idea, approached then as agents to empower rather than as beneficiaries to co-opt. And it's clear that this is not simply a project in political economy, it's also a religious project.
Right.
And it requires a transformation of the form of consciousness of the majority. What that means in the concrete American idiom, I don't know. That's an open question in this argument that we've been having. And that seems then, John, like a good place to stop and open it up to broader discussion.
Yeah.
In the fourth domain of education, what role, if any, do you see of curriculum and John Dewey?
Oh yes, I'm sorry. When I was speaking about education, I spoke about the political economic background, but I neglected to speak about the pedagogic paradigm, the method of teaching and learning, which education in this project requires. So I'll say something about that. So first of all, the point of departure is the imagination, as I described it. To understand natural or social phenomena, we have to understand how they change, because any understanding is understanding of change in the realm of the adjacent possible. If you don't understand how something changes into something else in this domain of the adjacent, you don't understand it at all. You just stare at it. It's retrospective rationalization. It's mystification. And that's what we have in many of the social sciences today. In the categories of the history of philosophy, we could describe them as right-wing Hegelianism. Their theme is the real is rational. No transformative imagination, no insight into structural change or structural. So that's the basis. And then, so what are the pedagogic criteria then? First, the focus has to be on the analytic and synthetic capabilities of the imagination, rather than on the mastery of dead information, the encyclopedia. Second, now, these capabilities of the imagination are not acquired in a vacuum of content. They're always acquired dealing with content. But with respect to content, what matters most is selective depth rather than encyclopedic superficiality. Third comes the idea that we traditionally call the idea of classical education. We should seek to instill in the individual student a kind of double vision. So he should be able to see with the eyes of his contemporaries, but also with other eyes of an alien experience. This was the idea of classical education in the West, which then appealed to the notion of education in the Greek and Roman classics. So the idea was you would be educated not just in the contemporary ideas, but in the ideas of a past civilization, which had a genealogical relation to your own. And the same idea in China. because the Chinese then sought to be educated in the Confucianist canon with the same notion that would be both remote and connected. So what's the problem with this idea of classical education? It's the dogmatic enforcement of a single canon. So we would want to have this idea of double vision, but to make our vision of the canon pluralistic. So there wouldn't be a single canon, but a multiplicity of canons. Now, fourth, the social setting of education should be cooperative. Cooperation is the method of advanced science, and it should exist even in the earliest stages of education. Cooperation among students, among teachers, among schools, so schools jointly teach together, combining presence and remote. And cooperation is then the replacement for what prevails in conventional education, which is the combination of individualism and authoritarianism. And fifth, and this is the most difficult, education should be dialectical. So everything should be taught at least twice from opposing perspectives. Nothing should be taught just once. And so in education, even in education at relatively early stages, we should seek to undermine the idea that there's a forced marriage between method and subject matter. This is the idea of the universities, right? That there's a favored method by which to study every subject, a favored way of looking at it. And at the same time, they all rest on philosophical, metaphysical presuppositions which they conceal. So we should try to instill in the young, through this dialectical approach, a resistance to the orthodoxies of the university culture. The national curriculums are a kind of infantilization of the orthodoxies of the university culture. We should do the opposite. We should immunize them so that they come to the higher stages of education already protected against the intellectual servility that prevails in the universities. In other words, our idea of basic education is that it should be more profound than university education, and therefore result in a transformation of the entire outlook. And this view of education, which I just summarized through these attributes, applies as well to technical education, because we would no longer have the old German idea of focus on job-specific and machine-specific skills and on the conventional trades, but the higher order practical and conceptual capabilities required for the operation of numerically controlled machine tools. So this idea of technical education is on a continuum with the new idea of general education. So in that way we form the individual who can be the worker in the knowledge economy, who can be the citizen in the high energy democracy, and who can be the social agent in the society that is multiplying the forms of collective action. So you can't accuse me of not doubling the bet.
So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about like what you see as the end goal then of the market and the state in this regard, from a more like philosophical is not quite the right word, but I was struck by.
No, we can't say philosophical. So what is the end? So I said at one point when I was describing this different view of what it means to be a progressive, to rise to a higher form of life. So it's to enter into the possession of life. So this is why it joins the message of the American prophets, yes, right? Yes. So if there is a supreme goal, the goal is life. Life comes before goodness or rightness. Life first. The poet Hölderlin said, "He who thinks most deeply loves what is most alive." So first life. And the attributes of life are excess over structure, right? It spills over, it resists. Spontaneity, surprise. So so that we be able to live our fecundity in our practical inventions and in our intellectual constructs is the reflection of this vitality. But so the basic idea is that we be able to live not as if we were half alive and then start dying by installments, but live in such a way that we can die only once and be fully alive until we die. And I think that's an American idea.
I guess, you know, the French like socialist leader in the protest, he kind of gave this like speech about the importance of free time. And what strikes me in your kind of characterization is just, it seems like a life just full of work. For better or
It's
for
a
worse,
life
positive
full
or
of life. No, it's a life full of life. And it's not just work, it's everything. So restless, sleepless, constant activity until you fall dead. I think that's the idea. And so you provoke me about the philosophical conception. And so there's this idea of self-construction has to be based on an acceptance of the contradictory character of the basis of self-construction. So to be alive, to form a self, we have to connect with other people, the self and others. But every connection threatens us with subjugation, with loss of personal identity. So then the question is, how can we connect without paying for connection the price of subjugation? And we have an experience of that in personal love, but we don't have an experience of that in the same way in life among strangers. Christ says, love the stranger, but we don't know how. And we suspect that that's impossible. So then the idea, the moral philosophers then offer us the cold comfort of an impersonal and altruistic benevolence, but we want something better. And what would be better would be cooperation among free and equal individuals of a higher form, not based on low trust and command and control, but on high trust. And that's realized then in these forms of politics and of the market. Then to be free, we have to engage in a particular world. But we have to engage without surrendering to it, because we're not free if we don't engage, but we're also not free if we engage and the price of engagement is surrender. We have to have a way of engaging without surrender, so that we can always be insiders and outsiders at the same time. And therefore we need our political and economic institutions to engage us without imprisoning us, to have this experimentalist character of facilitating their own revision. And then finally there's the relation of the self to itself. To be free, we have to form a coherent way of being, but we can't allow that coherent way of being to be an icon or a fetish that sucks the life out of us. So we have to form a coherent way of being, the character, but we have to be able also to disrupt it. And so the question then, translated into politics, is what way of organizing the economy and politics and society gives us the best chance to resolve these contradictions along this direction that I just described? That's a way of answering your question.
Yes.
I have a clarifying question and then a question about the clarifying question. So, clarifying, what was the point made about,
Louder, please.
sorry, what was the point made about the kind of expansion of federalism? I think I missed that point. Was
The
that a point?
expansion of federalism, what do you mean?
Or like a larger federalist state?
No. So the third set of innovations, I said, the third set of innovations that defines the agenda of a high-energy democracy is the ability to combine a facility for decisive action by the central government with radical devolution. So that, and then I said, society goes down a certain path, and instead of politics being organized as every party's second best solutions, and then a party gets to say, my solutions were never tried out. You say it will be decisively tried out, but at the same time, society will hedge its bets by allowing parts of itself to deviate from the predominant solutions and generate counter models of the national future. That was the idea. So there isn't a simple opposition between central action and deviation by the periphery. Now, experimentalist center-periphery relations conceived in this way go through two stages, I think. In the first stage, the emphasis is on cooperative federalism. Cooperation vertically and cooperation horizontally. So horizontal is cooperation among states and among municipalities. And there's an extraordinary amount of cooperation, horizontal cooperation, that already exists in the United States, although it's not a theme that appears in the American newspapers. And many of the most interesting institutional experiments in the United States now are now being conducted at the state level by the governors and their administrations under the aegis of this cooperative federalism. The second stage is when you reorganize things so that a particular part of the country, a state or even a sector of the economy, can deviate very widely. And here there's a paradox about federalism and unitary states. A unitary state is not a federation. It's like the United Kingdom or France. There's no division of federal power. And the paradox is that we always think that a federation should be an easier vehicle for experimentation. But in a unitary state, there's no presumption that all the parts of the state must enjoy simultaneously the same level of right of divergence. So, for example, the government of the United States, of the United Kingdom, can make a deal with Scotland that's different from the deal that it makes with Wales or with parts of England. So there's the possibility that divergence can be uniquely conferred on a part of the country. And that can make wide divergence easier. So the idea is you have this dialectic, again, of alternatives. You have the path, the main path, and then parts of the country diverging from it. Now, of course, this is dangerous, we know in American history, because states' rights can be the vehicle of oppression. So the right of divergence would have to be vetted both politically and judicially. But under those restraints, it then becomes a very powerful instrument for reinvention. Because, it's one thing for there to be an abstraction, like me sitting here in this room and outlining a programmatic alternative. But it's another thing to embody the abstraction in real policies and real arrangements. Then the country has a tangible image of an alternative national future. Now, you said that was the clarification question, but that there was another question.
It was, but I think the other question had to do with, historically when we have seen this, hasn't it led to, a lot, increased oppression? Thinking about the Civil War. But you kind of answered that question already.
Yes.
So thank you.
This comprehensive, brilliant vision that you've articulated is very compelling for me. Where would you start? What are the levers in which you would start to begin this truly revolutionary transformation?
So
of
I
the
think you
nation?
can start little. You can start little, but first of all, this question then provokes a very important thesis or clarification.
Right.
This is not a system.
Right.
So it's not there on an all or nothing thing. It's like a big package,
Right,
like
right.
the Marxist idea
That's
of
right.
the substitution
That's
of
right.
socialism by capitalism.
That was clear.
So in each place you look for a place to start. Now, I think normally you would start, the first place you would start is in political economy, because the common prejudice of the reformers in every society is that the reformation of democracy or politics comes first. In many countries, it's described as the mother of all reforms. But it's unrealistic for the following reason. No country reforms its state or its politics in order later to decide what to do with the reformed politics or the reformed state. The reformation of politics of the state happens only when it needs to happen so that the country can do something that it wants to do. And what in general it must want to do is to reorient its social and economic path. So I would say the most promising place to start is in the first element of the progressive political economy, the attempt to start the movement from a knowledge economy for the few to a knowledge economy for the many. So the Americans think of themselves always as potentially self-made men and women, agents and so forth. But the harsh reality is that the majority of people in the country, despite all of their dynamism and ambition and activity, are condemned to some kind of make work. So, and this has a social expression, but it also has a geographic expression, as in the question, why isn't there a knowledge economy in North Dakota? Now, the Republican governors, as part of this this cooperative federalism, this horizontal cooperative, are all of them, many of them, or all of them, trying to have their own little Silicon Valley. So, and these little Silicon Valleys, technological parks or something, they're like Potemkin villages. It's like a preposterous solution, but it's a preposterous solution to a real problem. So that has to be discarded, and then something else, which is this process of extension of the industrial counterpart to 19th century agricultural extension, lifting up part of the rear guard. When the rear guard is defined both as a set of firms and as a set of individual economic agents. So that's an example of where things might begin. But once there is movement in political economy, then movement can begin in the reformation of politics. And there I would say the most promising place to begin is federalism, and not the transformation of the relation of politics to money and to media. And then in the school system, because the Americans have a radical educational dualism. They have two school systems. They have a school system at the top, the elite tier of public schools and the private schools, and then a school system at below, which trains people in discipline and in the encyclopedia for a world that no longer exists. So the Rust Belt is disappearing, but the workers of the Rust Belt are being educated for that world still. The truth is that in the earlier form of production, there was lip service paid to education, but almost no real education was needed. Because in a Fordist mass production industrial factory, all the worker needs is rudimentary literacy and numeracy, the ability to understand instructions, verbal or written, discipline, taking orders, because it's a command and control structure, and elementary physical dexterity, especially in the form of hand-eye coordination. He doesn't need anything else. But now in the knowledge economy, there are real cognitive requirements to participate in the making of the knowledge economy. So of course what would be good, and it's very difficult to achieve, is to combine this visionary horizon with a lot of practical and technical detail. And this is what's so difficult, to be a technician and a visionary at the same time. But that's what's necessary.
I mean, there's right now in the nation, there's such a sense of alienation from the knowledge, those in the knowledge economy and the petty bourgeois, the aspiring petty bourgeois.
Yes.
it made me think that one of the early implements would be the requirement for every able-bodied adult serving in a military or social service, so that this radical alienation gets broken down and they recognize each other as.
So you would put solidarity first, national
I
solidarity.
would put solidarity, if not first, high up because
Uh-huh.
of the what I perceive to be this profound alienation between groups.
Which can only be overcome by their doing things together.
Exactly. And there's some precedent for that in Germany for a long period of time required everyone to serve in civil service or military at a time in which the Gastarbeiters were coming in, and it.
Well, that exists in the contemporary societies in two countries, one that is perpetually at war,
Yes.
Israel,
Yes.
and the other that is perpetually at peace, Switzerland. Switzerland.
Yeah.
Switzerland, because in
Germany
Switzerland
was at
everyone
peace
is
at
in
that time.
everyone is in the
Yes.
is-
Yes.
is
So
in the
and
army.
we're. Yeah. So it would, but it would help.
But the principle, the Republican principle is the army is not part of the nation paid for by the other parts to defend it, a mercenary form.
Right.
The army is the nation in arms.
That's right.
And that is indispensably the principle of Republican legitimacy.
Yes. I think I would say that would be for. I mean, I also think the comprehensiveness and its brilliance. I almost think it's utopian in one sense, but utopian in a way that can be actually realized within a democracy.
I think the subtlety is that we have to understand that these things reinforce each other and constrain each other.
Yes.
So the logic of transformation is what Trotsky described as combined and uneven
Yes.
development, right? If you have this set of proposals, arrangements, moves, short-term, long-term, so you start where you can,
Right.
you move as far as you can,
Right.
then you hit up against a limit which is imposed by the failure to advance in something else.
right. And
Then you turn to the other
that's
thing.
right, that's
So that's how it is.
That's
Huh?
right.
And so it's it's not a system, it's a structure.
Right.
But the attitude that one should have towards it is the attitude that Friedrich Schlegel described in the 19th century when he said, two things are fatal to the mind. One is to have a system and the other is not to have
That's
one.
right. That's
Huh?
right. That's
And
right.
so this is
So it needs to be the need for flexibility,
the need.
for intellectual as well as cultural.
And the primacy accorded to institutional arrangements that have this experimentalist quality, that are not prisons,
That's
huh?
right. That's right.
Because they invite their own supersession.
Yes.
That's what we would want.
Right. Right. Other questions, comments, criticisms?
I do think that there's a psychological consequence of this rhetorical strategy that I've adopted, because in this class I presented the whole, a simplified vision of the whole, schematic, but it's comprehensive. Huh?
Yes.
And that then induces the sense that this is a very tall mountain to climb. But we can climb it little by little, or
right,
we can
that's
climb
right,
it from
that's
different
right.
angles.
That's right.
Huh?
That's right. That's right.
And the fact that it's part of something larger, rather than discouraging us,
Yes.
should inspire us.
Yes, that's
Huh?
right.
To say this is part of this larger project,
Yes.
and which ultimately has this prophetic character, right?
Yes. Yes.
Because I was going to say earlier in our conversation, the Protestant Reformation had this idea that there are no priestly intermediaries
Right.
between the believer and God, right?
Between the self and
So it's the
God.
priesthood of all believers.
Right.
But now we have this idea that of the diffusion of prophetic powers in the whole of humanity, This is the idea of democracy,
Yes.
of a radical democracy or high energy democracy.
Yes.
And the school should approach every child as a tongue-tied prophet.
Yes,
Right?
yes,
So the school
yes.
under democracy must be the voice of the future.
Yes.
And it cannot be the instrument of the state, the family, or the university.
Right.
And this is a paradoxical ambition, because how can you jump over the present and speak in the name of something that doesn't exist?
That's right.
But it's this impossible ambition that somehow has to be achieved.
But that's why you include the dialectical nature of education, which I think is so important.
Yes.
Because it helps avoid the pitfalls.
So I think we're out of time.
Yes. We are.
Thank you for your patience. It's a little wild.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. It really is. And it's beautifully, intricately conceived.
Hello.